If wisdom could speak, what would wisdom say? I think in our culture, wisdom would have a lot to say, because it doesn't seem like many people would be listening. We live in a culture where fact has been replaced by feeling. Evaluation and examination has been replaced by emotion. Being consistent doesn't nearly carry the weight that it once did, nor does being logical or rational. There was a time in the past, not too many decades ago, when it was very common in culture and even especially on university campuses where there was a diversity of opinion for there to be some intelligent discussion about a particular topic upon which individuals disagreed. They're classified as a debate. Debate today has become kind of a bad word on those institutions of higher learning. If you disagree with me, I don't want to hear what you have to say at all. Debate? No, you might hurt my feelings. Debate? Not going to happen here. I wonder how many students going into a class, undergrad, postgrad, maybe back in even high school, junior high, if you can conceive of this conversation taking place back then, telling the professor on the first day of that course, if you try to teach me something that I already do not know or do not understand, or with which I do not agree, I'm not going to listen to you at all, because I'm perfectly comfortable with what I already know and already believe. How many of those students would pass? So why is it permissible to actually have this kind of behavior in culture? What would wisdom say if wisdom could talk? The book of Proverbs, wisdom does speak. And even though most of these, or majority of these, are Proverbs of Solomon, that's the way the introduction to Proverbs actually reads, wisdom is personified in several places in this book. It's given a voice. If it could talk, this is what it would say. But to begin with, the book of Proverbs, in the introduction, the first 9 verses of the book, says this: The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain wise counsel. To understand a proverb and an enigma, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. My son, hear the instruction of your father. Do not forsake the law of your mother, for they will be a graceful ornament on your head and ornamental chains about your neck. Before we talk about wisdom, I've got one question. What is an enigma? Without looking up in the dictionary, it's actually explained in the context of this verse. One of the many aspects of Hebrew poetry is that of parallelism. You have, and oftentimes you have the second phrase of the verse that actually explains the first phrase of the verse. Parallel statements. And you find that in verse 6 that we just read. To understand a proverb and an enigma, the words of the wise and the riddles. Notice the parallels. To understand a proverb, the first phrase, the words of the wise, the second phrase, those are equal statements. Proverb, word of the wise. First phrase, an enigma. Second phrase, riddle. So even if I didn't know what the term actually meant, I could ascertain that by the context of the verse. And if you look up the word enigma in a dictionary, you'll find it defined as a difficult saying, a puzzle, a riddle, just like it's described in this verse. There used to be a time when we would be more cognizant of learning more terms we could utilize and the meanings with which they would enrich our conversations. We really don't do that much anymore. That's kind of a lost art as well. What about wisdom? If wisdom could speak, what would wisdom say? Chapter 1 of Proverbs, verse 20. Wisdom calls aloud outside, raises her voice in the open squares, cries out in the chief concourses, the openings of the gates of the city. She speaks her words. And among the things she says are these. Verse 22, scorners delight in their scorning, fools hate knowledge. Verse 24, I've called and you refused, I've stretched out my hand and no one regarded. Verse 25, because you disdained all my counsel and will have none of my rebuke. Verse 28, they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me. And here's the reason, verse 29 and 30. Because they hated knowledge, did not choose the fear of the Lord, they would have none of my counsel, and despised my every rebuke. They are not listening, nor do they desire to listen. The very last verse of this chapter really is a positive note, however. Whoever listens to me, to wisdom, will dwell safely and be secure without fear of evil. Wisdom taking on a personality where wisdom talks. You're not listening is what wisdom says. I've tried to give you everything that you need, but you despise wisdom and instruction. You're not listening. Chapter 2 through 7 all begin in a very similar way. And it's again the idea of the parents, and specifically the father, talking to the children and instructing them. Notice the way each of these chapters begins. Chapter 2, verse 1. My son, if you receive my words and treasure my commands within you, so that you incline your heart to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding, and it continues from there. My son, listen. Chapter 3, verse 1. My son, do not forget my law, but let your heart keep my commands. For length of days and long life and peace they'll add to you. My son, listen. Chapter 4, verse 1. Hear, my children, the instruction of a father, and give attention to understanding. Listen. Chapter 5, verse 1. My son, pay attention to my wisdom, lend your ear to my understanding. Again, listen. Chapter 6, verse 1. My son, if you become a surety for your friend, if you have shaken hands and pledged for a stranger, being honest in your dealings with one another is the impact of this entire chapter, chapter 6. But it starts out again, my son. Chapter 7, verse 1. My son, keep the words and treasure of my commands within you. Keep my commandments and live. Keep my laws the apple of your eye, my son. Chapter 8 begins in a different way. Chapter 8, does not wisdom cry out and understanding lift up her voice? She takes her stand on the top of the high hill beside the way where the paths meet. She cries out by the gates, verse 3. And this is what wisdom says, verse 4. My voice is to the sons of men. Verse 6, I'll speak of excellent things. Verse 7, my mouth will speak truth. Verse 8, all the words of my mouth are with righteousness. Verse 9, they are plain to him who understands. Wisdom is something that speaks all the way through, all the way down to the end of chapter 8. And within that, wisdom says in verse 15, by me kings reign, rules decree justice, princes rule, and nobles. Verse 17, I love those who love me, and those who seek me, wisdom, diligently, will find me. Verse 22, however, still wisdom is the one that is speaking, has been used throughout the centuries to try to say that Jesus was a created being. Remember, wisdom is the subject. Here are the way the verses read, beginning in verse 22. The Lord possessed me, wisdom, at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I've been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there was no fountains abounding within the water, before the mountains were settled before the hills, I was brought forth. Verse 27, when he prepared the heavens, I was there. Verse 30, I was beside him as a master craftsman. I was daily his delight, rejoicing always with him and before him. The problem with making these verses relate to Jesus is the context doesn't allow that. And the context, starting from chapter 1, Solomon is concerned about wisdom and understanding being passed on to the next generation and the next and the next. So much so that not just his precepts, but the wisdom itself is given a voice. And this is what wisdom says. And what he enumerates in this chapter is wisdom is at the very essence of everything that God created. God didn't do anything foolishly. God didn't do anything without design. God didn't do anything without purpose. Wisdom was something that was always there. Even in the phrase, verse 30, I was beside him as a master craftsman. Wisdom was behind the design of everything that you find in God's creation. God takes his delight now and then in wisdom and knowledge. And the impact of that, when you start thinking about all these precepts in the book of Proverbs, if God places that kind of importance on wisdom, why don't we? If wisdom is something that is so pervasive in the very nature of God, why isn't wisdom something for which we strive? Instead of living a life based upon feeling, emotion, the desires of my heart rather than what the facts really are. Need to live in the real world and not an imaginary world where feelings rule the day. Because ultimately that is as unjust as anything could possibly be. My feelings would not match up with the facts of the case, nor would yours. When we start taking a look at context and start pulling things out that are really not present, we make some huge mistakes, and that's not handling the fact of God's word with any kind of wisdom whatsoever. Someone says, well, yeah, but you can see some characteristics of Jesus in these verses. Great, but Jesus isn't the subject. Wisdom is. The wisdom of God that permeates everything should permeate your life and mine. The next time somebody tries to tell you that Proverbs chapter 8 is a statement about Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, the only begotten Son of God, look at the context again. God is talking about the wisdom with which he created everything, and the wisdom from which, or by which, you and I need to live. May we endeavor to always have as much knowledge and understanding of God's word as we possibly can, and may we always be very wise in the way that we use it. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.